My own son once looked me in the eyes and said, "You've never done anything worth honoring." He didn't know who he was talking to. Because just days later a black helicopter landed in front of hundreds, and someone stepped out, stood tall, and called me ma'am. This is the story of what happens when a quiet mother, long dismissed, finally lets the truth speak for itself. Stay with me. You won't forget what you're about to hear. My name is Elaine Mercer. I'm 58 years old, a widow, and most days I live in a house that creaks louder than the phone ever rings. The walls in my little place in Oregon are filled with old books, photographs no one else remembers, and silence. Lots of silence. I've made peace with it. Or at least I thought I had. You wouldn't know it by looking at me, but I used to wear a uniform that meant something. The kind with bars and insignia that turned heads. I spent most of my life making decisions in rooms where no one dared raise their voice. I had clearance levels, a team responsibility. I made sacrifices, real ones. But now I spend more time folding tiny socks and heating bottles than anything else, because that's what Darren needs from me. Darren's my son. He's 34, sharp as a tack, and runs a tech startup out of Seattle with his wife Lena. They live in a townhouse that smells like eucalyptus candles and ambition. Their baby girl Clara just turned 3. She's got Lena's curls and Darren's stubborn streak. I love her more than air. She's the only reason I make that long drive every weekend. The one where the road seems to grow longer the more I realize how little space I actually take up in their world. Darren used to call me twice a week. Back when his father passed, we leaned on each other. But time changes things. Or maybe people change before time ever gets the chance. These days he calls when the sitter cancels, or when Lena has a Pilates class she can't reschedule. Lena never says thank you, not really. She leaves Post-it notes on the fridge Clara needs to nap at 1. Don't forget the snack with the green lid. Sometimes she texts me instructions while she's still at home upstairs doing her makeup or scrolling through some parenting blog. I don't argue. I don't remind her I raised a child without Google or Instagram. I just nod play tea party on the floor and make sure Clara gets to bed with a full stomach and brushed teeth. Darren barely looks up from his laptop when I arrive. He gives me the same kiss on the cheek he gave his high school math teacher, I imagine. Polite, brief, a formality. He doesn't ask if I'm tired, or if my back still aches from the fall last winter. He forgets my birthday 3 years in a row, but always remembers to Venmo me exactly $120 for gas money after I watch Clara. Never more, never less, as if affection should come with a receipt. One weekend I overheard him telling a friend on speakerphone, "Yeah, my mom helps out sometimes. She's been out of the workforce for decades." Basically a stay-at-home mom after my dad died. But she's good with kids. I sat at the edge of the couch, Clara asleep beside me, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A stay-at-home mom. That's what he thought I was. That's all he knew, as if my life had started and stopped with school lunches and permission slips. He never asked why I kept a locked cabinet in my bedroom. Never noticed the faint outline of a tattoo on my shoulder just barely hidden under cotton sleeves. He never questioned why I flinched at certain sounds or why I didn't sleep well when it rained too hard. I suppose that's my fault. I kept the stories tucked away like medals in a drawer, out of sight, out of reach. I chose silence thinking it would protect him, thinking it would keep the world gentler around him. Instead, it erased me. Last Thanksgiving, Lena reorganized the living room and swapped out all the family photos. She put up matching gold frames with pictures of Clara's milestones, Darren's speaking engagements, their vacation to Greece. I looked for a photo of their wedding one I knew I was in. It wasn't there. Later that evening, I found it in a box in the garage, still in its original frame. Darren hadn't even bothered to remove the dust before storing it away. I never expected praise. I never wanted the spotlight. But I think every mother hopes that one day her child will really see her. Not just as the woman who folded his laundry or kissed his forehead at night, but as a person, with a story, with a past, with worth. Instead, I've become background noise, reliable, predictable, replaceable. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I stopped showing up, if I just disappeared. Would he notice? Would Clara ask, would Lena find someone else on care comm by Monday? I don't resent them, not really. But there's a loneliness in being needed only for what you can do, not for who you are, and it seeps into your bones if you let it. Last Saturday, I stood in their living room while Darren poured wine for Lena and their guests. Clara was already asleep upstairs, and I was about to let myself out. I looked around. The mantel was filled with pictures, Darren shaking hands at a conference, Lena holding Clara at the beach family portraits with her parents during Christmas. There was laughter in every frame, warmth, inclusion. But not a single one included me. And so I stood there, invisible in plain sight, hands folded in front of me, watching my own absence glow in every golden frame. 2 weeks after that quiet moment in their living room, where I realized I didn't exist in their photo frames, came an invitation. Well, not a proper one. A forwarded evite from Lena with the subject line, "Celebration for Darren. Promotion party." In the body of the email she added, "One personal note, Elaine, we'd love for you to come. Just please dress simply. The vibe is modern, clean, nothing flashy. Mostly young people and press, so let's keep it classy." That last part stung. Let's keep it classy, as if I had ever shown up in rhinestones and feather boas. But I understood what she meant. Be invisible. Fit in. Don't draw attention. Don't remind anyone you're older or part of a world they can't relate to. I stared at the email for a long time before replying. Just a short, "Of course, I'll be there." The event was held at a sleek downtown venue in Seattle, one of those converted loft spaces with exposed brick-polished concrete floors and Edison bulbs dangling like low-hanging stars. Darren's company had just secured a 7-figure contract with a major logistics firm, and Lena had pulled out all the stops. Local media were invited. The catering was artisanal. There was even a branded step-and-repeat wall for photos. When I arrived, no one offered to take my coat. I walked past a group of 20-somethings talking about crypto and microdosing like it was small talk. I found a quiet spot near the back behind the custom cocktail bar where they were serving drinks with names like The Disruptor and Tectonic Shift. Lena's mother, Valerie, was already surrounded by people. She wore a pearl gray pantsuit and a silk scarf knotted perfectly at her collarbone. When Lena introduced her on the microphone, she called her "my rock, my role model," and the reason I believe women can do it all. Applause. Then she motioned toward me, standing quietly behind a column. And of course, a special thank you to Darren's mom, Elaine, who's kept our little Clara happy and healthy while we built our dream. You are an incredible babysitter. Babysitter. The word settled like gravel in my stomach. I smiled, nodded politely, but inside I was unraveling. I wasn't expecting a spotlight, but I wasn't expecting to be minimized either. Valerie got praise for ambition. I got acknowledgement for availability. A few minutes later, I was sipping water when a woman in a designer dress wandered over, smiling graciously. "So, Elaine. Right? What did you do before becoming the family MVP?" Before I could answer, Darren swooped in from behind, drink in hand, tie slightly loosened. "Oh, Mom." "She was a full-time homemaker," he said with a chuckle. "She's always been super punctual, though. You can set your watch by her." The woman laughed, slightly confused. "Really? That's sweet. I always thought you had a military bearing or something." Darren waved it off. "Nah, that's just Mom's way. She's tidy, reliable. Raised me like clockwork. I always had clean socks. And that was it. That was my life reduced to socks and a schedule. The years spent overseas, the nights I slept with one eye open, the briefings, the operations, the near misses, all of it erased in a single smirk. Later that evening, while making small talk near the dessert table, I overheard 2 guests whispering. One of them gestured toward me with her drink. "Is that Darren's mom?" "Yeah. Every time I visit, she's cleaning or wiping something. I thought she was staff." I turned away before they could see the expression on my face. I didn't want pity. I didn't want apologies. I just wanted not to be invisible. As the night ended and the guests started gathering their coats, Darren walked me to the door. It was one of the few moments we were alone. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, barely glancing at me. "And for all the help lately." I nodded. "You're welcome. It was a beautiful party." He hesitated, then added with a casual shrug. "You know, sometimes I think about how you've never really done anything people talk about. I mean," he laughed awkwardly. "Not like it's a bad thing, but you've lived such a quiet life. Not really noteworthy." He said it like he was pointing out the weather, like it was just a fact. "You've never done anything worth honoring." And just like that, he turned to hug Lena's cousin goodbye, leaving me standing in the open doorway, coat in hand, air caught in my throat. I walked out into the Seattle night, the wind biting harder than it had in weeks, and for the first time in years, I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just felt hollow. Because Darren didn't mean to hurt me. That's what cut the deepest. He genuinely didn't know there was more to me. And I had no one to blame but myself. The drive home that night was long and silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just let the city lights blur past the windshield as my mind pressed against memories I had folded so carefully away for years. When I reached my small house on the outskirts of Eugene, I kicked off my shoes and walked to the hall closet. Tucked behind an old vacuum and boxes of Clara's forgotten toys was a wooden trunk, unmarked, unassuming, heavy with time. It had sat there undisturbed for over a decade. No one had ever asked about it. I pulled it out slowly and carried it to the living room. The lock still clicked like it used to, firm and final. I lifted the lid. Inside were pieces of a life no one knew I'd lived. A folded flag wrapped in a military-grade seal. A manila envelope stamped confidential in red. My final deployment orders yellowed slightly at the edges. Copies of internal commendation reports. An encrypted field journal, its pages mostly blank but for dates, code names, and timestamps. I ran my fingers across the front of a worn black-and-white photograph. Me, age 31, standing on the tarmac at Ramstein Air Base, flanked by 4 other analysts, all now either retired or buried. I held that photo close to my chest. There was another envelope thinner marked with a brass seal, a nomination form. I opened it and reread the language I'd long memorized: recommendation for meritorious service. Commander Elaine Mercer. Strategic Risk Command Operation, Laurel Echo. I had earned that recognition during a mission no one outside the Pentagon would ever hear about. A last-minute evacuation of a foreign embassy during political collapse. I led the intel team that intercepted the critical breach. We worked around the clock for 72 hours, triangulating troop movement, negotiating a corridor under NATO airspace, and coordinating a multi-agency exfiltration through a civilian route. It wasn't glamorous. It was silent surgical. But it saved lives. I wasn't in the photos. I wasn't in the news. I was in the secure footnotes of history. And I had accepted that. Back then, I signed clearance agreements that came with sharp warnings. You are not permitted to disclose your service outside authorized channels. Violation will result in prosecution. The language was stark, and I honored it, because that was the job. That was the oath. I closed the nomination form and sat back on the floor. The room was dim, lit only by a small table lamp in the corner, its amber light softening the edges of every truth I'd tried to hide from myself. I had been someone. Not someone loud, not someone famous, but someone who mattered. Darren had no idea. And why would he? I had never told him. I let him believe the version that was easier to swallow. The version where his mother folded laundry, picked up soup cans with coupons, and looked forward to Sunday dinners with her grandson. I never told him about the years I wasn't here. I never told him about the nights I woke from dreams still smelling of burned sand and satellite static. I never told him that I once briefed senior staff at the Joint Intelligence Operations Center in Stuttgart, flanked by advisors in 5 languages coordinating intelligence on cross-border threats that never made the evening news. Because I was always supposed to be invisible. But that night, sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, I began to feel the weight of that silence differently. I had chosen quiet out of honor, but now it was starting to feel like surrender. I pulled an old file from the bottom of the trunk, a folder marked Echo Red, Discontinued Access, Vault 72. It contained a list of field contacts now mostly inactive and one small plastic keycard. I hadn't touched that card in 11 years, not since the day I handed in my final active clearance badge and boarded a civilian flight home. Taped to the back of the keycard was a tiny printed code handwritten in fading ink. If compromised, deactivate. If summoned, respond. If forgotten, remember. I whispered the words to myself like a prayer. My throat tightened. I walked to my desk and pulled open the drawer beneath an old stack of utility bills. Hidden underneath was a black hard case phone. Thick, outdated by modern standards, but once unbreakable. It had no browser, no camera, just one purpose. I plugged it into the wall. The old military-grade connector hummed faintly. I expected it to die on boot. But it didn't. The screen lit up after 30 silent seconds. System rebooting. Last access October 3rd, 2012. Encryption key required. I closed my eyes and typed the 12-digit cipher. A beat. Then, connection established. Secure net. Echo 9. Engaged. Remote server inactive. Redirecting to archive mode. The screen flashed again. One file blinked at the top. Reactivate protocol. Ghostvine. Initiation pending. I didn't press it. Not yet. But I stared at that line until the glow of the screen became a part of the room's stillness. So many years of silence. So many unspoken histories. And maybe it had been enough. Maybe it was time to stop letting other people write my story for me, I whispered aloud. Not to the phone, not to the empty house, but to myself. Maybe it's time. I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to, because I had already begun. I hadn't worn the uniform in over 10 years. Not the real one, not the dress blues with the silver insignia and the lined bars that traced each invisible story across my chest. I kept it buried in the back of a cedar trunk, wrapped in archival tissue folded sharp and clean, the way they taught us back at Fort McClellan. Touching it again felt like reaching for someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A version of myself preserved like a myth. But the stitching no longer fit. My shoulders had changed. My waist, too. And I wasn't about to show up with brass that sagged or cuffs that looked tired. If I was going to step out of the shadows, even part way, I wanted to do it right. So I took the garment bag, sealed it carefully, and drove 2 hours to the only tailor I trusted. An old shop tucked between a bait store and a used bookstore on the east side of Pendleton. The sign hadn't changed in 20 years, Marquez Tailoring and Sons. S. 1944. I rang the bell on the counter and waited. From the back emerged a woman I didn't recognize, probably one of the granddaughters now. But when she unzipped the bag, her eyes widened. "Is this?" She trailed off, brushing her hand lightly over the general star on the cuff. "It needs to be adjusted," I said simply. "Not altered. Just brought back to form." She nodded gently. "We can make room in the shoulders again." "You wore it recently." I shook my head. Not since the last official brief. But there might be one more coming. She didn't ask questions. The best tailors never did. After taking the measurements, I stepped outside, and that's when I heard the familiar voice behind me. "Elaine Mercer," he said. "I'll be damned." I turned slowly. Colonel Maddox. Same gravel-stained voice, same hawk-eyed stare, only his hair had shifted. Now silver at the temples cut closer than regulation ever required. He wore a civilian windbreaker, but the posture gave him away long before his badge did. "You're far from invisible out here," he said, stepping closer. "I wasn't trying to be seen," I replied. "That's never stopped you from being noticed." We stood in silence for a beat. The last time I'd seen him was at a closed-door simulation briefing in Brussels where we sat on opposite sides of a war game that almost turned real. He'd led tactical ops. I ran strategic intel. We didn't always agree, but we respected each other. More than most did. "You still at Liberty?" I asked. "Training next gen? Teaching them not to screw up what we built?" I nodded. "Good. You back in the game?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure." He tilted his head. "That uniform says otherwise. I just need it clean. I'm not walking back into anything. Not yet." He didn't push. He just pulled a card from his coat and handed it to me. "Come by if you change your mind. We run closed-door briefs Thursdays. No cameras, no chatter." I slipped the card into my pocket. "Thanks. Elaine," he said, before I turned. "Don't wait too long. They're not just requesting you, they're remembering what you did." I gave him a nod. Not affirmation, just acknowledgement, and walked to my car. Back home that night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the list of encrypted contacts on my old secure phone. Most were gray. Dead links, decommissioned addresses, silent now. But one blinked orange. Tree. Com HQ Echo Chain, requesting confirmed clearance contact. Immediate tactical consultation. Priority high. I tapped it open. Message. "You are requested to review threat intercepts related to OP Merlin variants. Advisory consult closed door. Expected arrival, 48 HRs. Location undisclosed until confirmation." No names, no location. But I knew that tone. This wasn't a drill. I reached for the small leather folder I kept tucked in the bottom of my kitchen drawer. Inside were laminated transit clearances, travel authorizations, and one forged civilian itinerary. Renewed every year like clockwork, just in case. I didn't know yet what they wanted from me, but I knew where I had to be next. Seattle. I packed light, a pressed civilian blazer, one encrypted tablet, the corrected uniform. Still in the tailor's garment bag, and the same boots I wore during my last official field visit. I didn't tell Darren. He didn't ask anyway. As far as he knew, I was just watching Clara next weekend. As far as he cared, I was the dependable presence who showed up on time and left no trace behind. And maybe that's what made it easier to disappear when needed. I turned off the kitchen light and left one sticky note on the fridge. Gone for the weekend. Don't wait up. Mom. No signature, no explanation. Just quiet steps out the door and into the dark. But this time I wasn't retreating. I was advancing, silently, deliberately, into whatever waited for me next. I didn't plan to attend. Honestly, I didn't even know about the seminar until one of Darren's former classmates forwarded the flyer to me with a cheerful, "Look at your son go" typed underneath. Resilience in Innovation. One man's journey from humble roots to tech trailblazer. Keynote by Darren Mercer. Founder and CEO, Stride Vision Technologies venue. Pearson Hall, University of Washington. I stared at the title longer than I should have. Humble Roots. Journey. The words stretched wide on the screen, clean font professionally branded. There was a picture of Darren, arms crossed, confident chin tilted slightly upward. Behind him, the blurred background of their new glass and concrete headquarters. It looked more like a campaign ad than a seminar. I hadn't been invited, of course, but I didn't need an invitation to sit quietly in the back and listen to my own story be rewritten. So I went. I dressed plainly. Gray slacks, navy coat hair tied back, no uniform, no insignia, just a pair of worn leather gloves and a silent badge tucked inside my purse. I chose a seat near the far right exit, one row from the very back. The kind of seat you take when you don't want to be seen but want to see everything. The hall filled up fast. Students, faculty, a few industry sponsors, and some reporters from local tech outlets. I watched Darren backstage through the glass. He was laughing with Lena checking the mic taped to his collar. They'd built something, no doubt about that. But what surprised me wasn't the success. It was how Darren carried it like it had grown from nothing but his will alone. When he finally stepped onto the stage, the applause was instant rehearsed proud. His voice filled the auditorium with the ease of someone who believed every word of his own story. "I wasn't born into success," he began. "I didn't grow up with money or mentors or connections. What I had was a small town, a single parent, and a whole lot of determination." I sat still. No mention of who that parent was, no detail, just enough to paint the outline of struggle without naming the hands that held him through it. He continued, "Our home was modest. Our meals were simple. No one in my family had ever built a company. No one had worn a title or earned an award." He paused for effect. "I came from a family of good people, hard workers, but ordinary. That word landed harder than I expected, as if 2 decades of classified deployments, high-risk command briefings, and international crisis interventions could be boiled down to ordinary. But Darren wasn't lying, not in his eyes. He was telling the truth as he believed it, the version he'd decided was cleanest for the narrative. A hand went up in the crowd. A young woman in a UW lanyard stood with a press pass around her neck. "Did anyone in your family serve?" she asked. "Military, intelligence, diplomatic corps?" Darren gave a slight laugh. "No, actually. I'm the first in my family to take a leadership path like this. We didn't have that kind of legacy. Just quiet lives." There was a murmur of note-taking, a few nods from the audience. I didn't move. Next to me, one of the campus security officers shifted. He had just finished checking the emergency exit when his gaze paused on the small key fob clipped inside my open tote. It was matte black, barely visible, but the marking on the side glowed faintly. A silver triangle nested in a circle surrounded by Latin script that no civilian would recognize. He stared for half a beat, then looked at me directly. "You're," he whispered, barely audible. I turned slightly toward him, but before I could respond, the vibration in my purse buzzed hard. Longer than usual. I reached down, heart already bracing. "Incoming encrypted alert. Extraction ETA 4 minutes. Prepare for arrival. Location confirmed." I blinked. "No, not here. Not now." But there it was, the red line blinking across the screen. "Emergency intercept update. High priority consult confirmed." They were coming. I looked up at the auditorium again. Darren was still speaking, holding the room like a well-practiced actor. Sometimes when you come from a quiet background, people underestimate what you're capable of. I think that gave me an edge. The irony almost made me laugh. The hum came first, just faint enough to question. Then the flicker of lights in the rear. A shifting wind, unnatural. Heads started turning. Whispers. Eyes glancing up toward the high windows lining the side of the lecture hall. The sound built slowly. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat shaking the sky. I knew that rhythm. Every soldier knows it, the unmistakable pulse of rotors. Outside, the students nearest the exits paused. A few ran to the glass, some lifted phones. And then the room fell into a strange hush. Not silence, but anticipation. That moment, when an unexpected presence shifts the balance of everything. Where words no longer fill space the way sound does. I sat still. No one knew who I was. Not yet, but in less than a minute they would. The hum began like a tremor in my chest. I had felt it before. In deserts, in war zones, near conflict lines no one ever admitted existed. It's not just the sound of a helicopter that makes people freeze. It's the rhythm, the way it vibrates through your bones before your ears can place it. I looked up. From the last row of the university auditorium, I could see students exchanging glances. The guest panelist, an eager young tech entrepreneur, paused mid-sentence. And Darren, still standing at the podium under soft stage lights, glanced toward the ceiling with a furrowed brow. The first window panels shook. Someone murmured, "Is that?" I already knew. That precise, controlled pulse. Not a media helicopter, not medical transport, military. I inhaled, deeply, almost out of reflex, muscle memory from years ago. One hand tightened around the handle of my purse, not from fear, but awareness. Calculation. A readiness that never fully fades. Then came the shift in the air. That sudden, unspoken change in a crowd when something happens that no one rehearsed for. It's not panic yet. It's uncertainty. And in uncertainty, truth slips through the cracks. From my seat in the corner, I rose. Slowly, deliberately. I walked toward the rear exit unnoticed by most. The walls of the auditorium reverberated again. This time clearer. The unmistakable rhythm of blades descending. Precision rotors, government issue. My phone buzzed once in my purse. Clearance echo priority. ETA 3 minutes. Confirm position. I stepped into the hallway outside. Glass doors led out to the lawn. That's when I saw it. Sleek, black. Clean lines and matte finish designed to avoid detection. Now impossible to ignore. The insignia subtle but distinct Pentagon logistics and field coordination. The crowd inside began to stir. A few voices raised. More phones came out. Students rushed to the doors. And then it landed. Grass flattened beneath the weight of the wind. Leaves scattered across the walkways like confetti from an invisible celebration. And through it all, no music played. Just the thunder of arrival. A side panel slid open, and he stepped out. I recognized him instantly. Full dress blues. Combat boots polished to a mirror shine. A posture that spoke of decades under discipline. Colonel Samuel Reyes. I hadn't seen him in nearly 8 years. Last time was a sealed door briefing in Belgium. He had been a major then. Now he was here. For me. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around, didn't wave or offer pleasantries. He just walked, straight past the videographers, past the student volunteers in matching t-shirts, past Lena, who stood frozen under the welcome banner mouth slightly agape. Her eyes locked onto the insignia on his uniform but clearly didn't understand what she was seeing. Colonel Reyes pushed through the double doors like he belonged in every room he entered. The lecture had come to a complete halt. Darren stood behind the podium speech slides, forgotten mouth parted as if mid-thought. The mic in front of him remained live, capturing the confused rustle of the audience. The colonel didn't even glance at him. He walked down the center aisle, toward me, toward the woman they had all ignored at the back of the room. A ripple followed him. Gasps, whispers, questions. I stood in place. Still, quiet, but not invisible anymore. He reached me, heels clicking softly against the polished floor, and in front of the entire room he stopped, stood at attention, and raised his hand. A formal salute, sharp, crisp, held with absolute precision. "Ma'am," he said, voice resonant but calm. "We've been instructed to escort General Mercer. The Pentagon requests your presence for immediate consultation." Silence. The kind of silence that follows news that can't be processed. I felt the stillness ripple through the rows of students, professors, alumni, faculty, Lena. Even the press rep with her clipboard who now looked at her notes like they had betrayed her. Darren blinked, swallowed, took one step away from the podium. "What?" He said it quietly, almost under his breath, like a question he hadn't meant to say out loud. I turned to him then, only briefly, enough to meet his gaze. I didn't glare. I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. Because he saw it now, the thing he never bothered to ask about. The weight behind the quiet, the discipline in my bones, the way I carried myself, the reason I never needed a podium to hold power. I adjusted the strap of my purse and nodded once to Colonel Reyes. Then I stepped forward. He turned to escort me not as a gesture, but out of protocol, He knew better than to offer an arm. I walked beside him, not behind. The crowd parted, as if on instinct. Some stood, some reached for their phones. A woman in the second row whispered to her colleague, She's a general." Another voice younger from the press section. "Did she just say Mercer? Is that Darren's mom?" The walk to the doors felt longer than it was. Not because of nerves, but because time stretched under eyes that had never seen me before. Not truly. Behind me, I heard Darren's voice again. "Wait. General, that's not... She's just..." But he stopped, because there was nothing else to say. I stepped outside. The wind caught the edge of my jacket. The sunlight blinked off the helicopter's tail. The pilot stood ready at the ramp, one hand raised against the breeze. Reyes turned to me. "Ready, ma'am?" I glanced back one last time. Just for a second. Darren stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. Lena behind him, her hand clutched around her phone, not recording, just holding on. And further behind them, a sea of eyes that had once overlooked me, now filled with questions they didn't even know how to ask. I didn't answer them, didn't explain, didn't justify. I climbed aboard. The helicopter hum had long faded behind us, replaced by the steady vibration of a government jet slicing through the sky. Somewhere below, 1,000 timelines were splitting apart. People rethinking what they thought they knew, headlines, shifting voices rising. I sat quietly, seatbelt snug against my waist, my purse at my feet. Across from me, Colonel Reyes reviewed documents on a tablet with the cool, collected rhythm of someone who had done this too many times to be rattled. He hadn't spoken much since we boarded. But he didn't need to. My phone, silenced but still connected to the world I had long stepped back from, was buzzing non-stop inside my bag. At first, I ignored it. Then I gave in. Not to the calls, There were dozens of them now, most from unknown numbers, a few from the Pentagon, and one briefly from my neighbor's landline. But to the headlines, I tapped into the private government feed, which now mirrored most of what the public could already see, no longer buried, no longer classified. There it was. Who is General Mercer? Helicopter. Interrupts. Tech talk to retrieve mystery woman. Darren Mercer's mother revealed to be retired. U.S. General. Family. Had no idea. Silent power. The hidden past of a decorated female commander. And beneath it, videos. Clips taken from 3 angles, all capturing the same moment. Colonel Reyes saluting. Me standing. The phrase, General Mercer, hanging in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. I watched it once. That was enough. I closed the app. Reyes looked up from his screen. "You okay?" I nodded. "I'm not surprised. Just reminded." He nodded back. "It doesn't stay quiet forever, not when it was real." When we landed in D.C., there were no cameras waiting. That was by design. I was escorted through a side entrance, greeted by 2 junior officers with stiff backs and unsure eyes. They didn't speak much either. Maybe they weren't supposed to. Maybe they were just in awe. Or maybe, like most people under 30, they had never imagined a general could also be someone's mother. Or someone like me. The briefing room was simple. Sterile. 4 walls, 2 flags a screen, and a sealed file marked CIV IRS Consult, classified. The room had changed little since I was last here, but the man sitting at the head of the table had General Keith Sanderson. We had once been peers, though the system liked to pretend otherwise. He was now 4 stars and hardened by bureaucracy. But as I walked in, he stood, "Elaine, General." He motioned for me to sit. "I want to begin with a formal apology," he said. I didn't respond. He sighed. "The fact that you were removed from our internal systems was regrettable. Not intentional, just a result of transitions during the last restructuring cycle. I wasn't asking for reinstatement. I know. But you deserved better. He glanced at the screen behind him where a classified threat briefing loomed waiting to be reviewed. But for once, he didn't press forward. "We can't stop the news from spreading," he said. "It's out there now. You've become a symbol." I raised an eyebrow. Of what restraint? Strength? Dignity? Everything we haven't taught this generation well enough. I looked down at my folded hands. "I'm not interested in being a symbol," I said quietly. "Unfortunately, you don't have a choice anymore." I left the room with no new orders, no new missions. Just, acknowledgement, a long overdue nod from the system that once made me invisible. When I returned to my hotel, I turned on the TV. There he was. Darren, standing outside his office building, flanked by reporters wearing a rumpled sport coat and an expression that didn't know whether to collapse or double down. A microphone caught his voice mid-response. Look, I had no idea. She never told me. I genuinely thought she was a homemaker. My dad died early. She never talked about any of it. The camera caught the flicker in his eyes. Something between embarrassment and disbelief. Not just at the public attention, but at the fact that his narrative was no longer the only one. One journalist asked bluntly, "So you lied when you said no one in your family served?" Darren looked away. I didn't lie. I just didn't know. It wasn't a good answer. Lena apparently didn't wait for the rest. That evening, her social media accounts were wiped clean of anything mentioning me. Old family photos disappeared. Captions were edited. My name removed from birthday posts, Mother's Day tags, even the baby shower thank yous I had paid for, and quietly organized years ago. I tried calling once, just to see. Blocked. There was no message, just a blank tone and a dead end. I sat with that for a while. Not because I didn't expect it, but because part of me had hoped for just a moment that truth might soften them. But it didn't. And I was okay with that, because in the end, I had lived honestly. They had simply refused to see it. I opened the secure line on my tablet and pulled up a folder I hadn't touched since my final deployment. Operation Laurel Echo. Field Intel and Mission Outcome Reports. Inside were a series of debriefings, old voice logs, encrypted scans of satellite feeds, and one personal commendation note from my former superior. It was written by hand, scanned into the digital archive. I hadn't read it in years. "Elaine, you won't get a parade, you won't be on a postage stamp, but what you did changed the outcome of something the world will never know it almost lost. That's the nature of your service. That's the cost of doing it right. They'll never understand your silence, but I do." D. A. Roth. I read it twice. Then I closed the file. Let the headlines scream. Let the critics circle. Let Darren scramble. I was done explaining myself. Some honors don't arrive in public. Some victories are quiet. And some generals never need to speak. They've already done enough. The headlines had started to quiet down by the fourth day. That's how news cycles work. Fast, hungry, and quick to move on once the next scandal surfaces. But what they left behind was something harder to shake the whispers that linger after the shouting stops. I wasn't surprised when people began reaching out. Some were strangers, young women who said I reminded them of their grandmothers. Silent pillars holding up families who never stopped to ask what came before them. Others were former colleagues, many now retired, writing in coded lines or cautious texts. But one message stopped me cold. It came from someone I hadn't heard from in nearly 2 decades. Dean Sullivan, a former field tech officer who once served under my command during the Laurel Echo mission. He'd always been sharp but quiet, the kind of soldier who saw everything and said little. His email subject line read, "Letter you deserved to know about." Inside was a scanned image. Faded ink on lined yellow paper folded once down the center. It was my late husband's handwriting. Elaine. I don't know if Darren will ever ask about you, but if he does, tell him what you did matters. Tell him you wore a uniform that held lives together, that your silence wasn't emptiness. It was duty. He won't understand at first. Boys rarely do. But someday he might. The note was dated a few months before Mark passed. Apparently he'd left it for Darren, tucked into a file box that sat in our attic for years before Darren took it when he moved out. Dean's message below was brief. Ma'am, I overheard Darren mention this letter in D.C. Once. He read it. Said it sounded like fiction. Said it wasn't real. Figured you should know. I sat back in my chair and let the weight of that settle in. So he had known. Or rather, he had been told in the quietest, most heartfelt way a father could offer truth. But he didn't believe it. Or didn't want to. Because it didn't fit the version of me that made sense to him. The version that served his story. I wanted to feel anger, but all I felt was grief. Not just for the betrayal, but for the willful erasure. He had chosen not to see me. That's harder to forgive than ignorance. Later that afternoon, another document came through a back channel from a former administrative aide at the Department of Defense. An internal memo flagged with concern now quietly leaked. Subject Merit Award block request. Civilian decorated service commendation source external request. Lena Mercer, private citizen. Concern potential brand misalignment with existing Mercer Tech narrative and values. Lena. She had filed a formal objection, not because she doubted my service, not because she had questions, but because she believed my name, my history, could taint the clean lines of her curated world. Elaine Mercer didn't fit into their lifestyle blog, their venture capital network, their minimalist family brand. So she tried to make me disappear. And I let her. Not directly, not knowingly, but with every year I stayed silent, with every time I said nothing when someone called me just the babysitter or just a mother, I gave them space to erase me. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I didn't turn on the TV. Instead, I opened the old storage chest again. This time, not to remember, but to decide. I laid the uniform on the bed, still pressed, still dignified. I lifted the medal I never wore, the one awarded but never given in public. I read over the lines of my own service summary, annotated in red from a time when men still needed to double-check what women claimed to have done. Then came the final email of the evening. From Melissa Zhang, my oldest friend. We had met at a security briefing in Sarajevo in '97, bonded over cold coffee and shared exhaustion. She retired early, moved to Arizona, and opened a tiny bookstore that somehow still survived in the Amazon era. Her message was short, but it landed harder than anything else that week. Subject silence. Elaine. I watched the footage. I read the articles. You're being brave like always, but it's not enough. The next generation needs to hear your voice. If you stay silent, they'll fill in your story for you. And they'll get it wrong. Talk, write, speak. Before it's too late, don't let them own your truth. I reread that message more times than I'd like to admit. Not because I didn't believe it, but because part of me had forgotten that truth unspoken eventually becomes truth rewritten. I walked into the bedroom, turned on the small lamp by the dresser, and reached for the full-length mirror tucked behind the closet door. I stood there for a long time. Then I slipped on the dress uniform, one sleeve at a time. I adjusted the collar, ran my fingers across the line of ribbons on the left side of my chest. Checked the pins. Brushed the shoulders. Then I looked up. What I saw wasn't a headline. It wasn't a symbol. It wasn't General Mercer. It wasn't even Mom. It was just me. A woman who had carried lives in her decisions, who had held the weight of silence like armor, and who had chosen again and again not to demand recognition, but who now understood the difference between humility and erasure. For the first time in years, I didn't see a shadow of who I used to be. I saw a mother fully awake. The invitation came in the mail. Not email, not text. Just a simple cream-colored envelope with the seal of the United States Military Academy embossed in gold. Inside was a letter, formal but not cold. On behalf of the Academy's Leadership Studies Department, we invite General Elaine Mercer to deliver a keynote address for our graduating cohort. Theme: Leadership in Silence. Your legacy, though, long quiet, now speaks louder than ever. I held the letter in my hand for a long time. Leadership in silence. It was a phrase I hadn't heard before, but one I felt deep in my bones. There were 1,000 reasons to say no. I didn't like cameras. I had no desire for applause. And my voice wasn't the kind that commanded attention. It was measured, restrained, a product of years where calm saved lives. But something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was Melissa's message. Maybe it was the look I'd seen in the mirror that night. Or maybe I was just tired of letting everyone else do the talking. So I said yes. The morning of the ceremony, the campus was still wrapped in fog. Cadets marched in quiet formation across the open grounds, their boots leaving sharp prints behind them. Families gathered in clusters, some carrying signs, others just watching their children with pride leaking from their eyes. I wore the uniform again. This time not as armor but as acknowledgement. A quiet claim to a life that had been lived fully, even if no one had clapped for it at the time. The auditorium wasn't enormous, but it held weight. Flags hung heavy on the walls. The front row was filled with brass. The rest? Young faces, most no older than Darren when he left for college, full of ambition and questions. I stepped up to the podium as my name was announced. No fanfare, no anthem, just a stillness. And I spoke. My name is Elaine Mercer. I began. I served 28 years in operational and strategic intelligence. I retired with the rank of general, though that was never what mattered most to me. I let the pause settle. My son once told me, I said, eyes scanning the front row but drifting toward the back, that I'd never done anything worth honoring. A quiet murmur moved across the crowd. I waited. Then I continued. But that's the thing, isn't it? Honor isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. And most of the time it's not given when it's deserved. It's given when it's noticed. And that can take a very long time. In the far back corner, just beside the final column, a figure had slipped in. I didn't look directly, but I knew. Darren. His posture was different now. Shoulders not squared with pride, but slumped with something closer to humility. His eyes weren't scanning the crowd or watching a screen. They were fixed on me. For once not out of confusion, but attention. I turned back to the audience. There are moments in your service, military or otherwise, when no one will thank you, when no one will see what you gave up, when the people closest to you will forget, dismiss, or rewrite what you stood for. That doesn't mean you were wrong. It just means they weren't ready to understand. The air shifted. I could feel it in the rows. I paused again, then softened my voice. Important isn't always visible. Sometimes it's simply this: showing up when others walk away, standing when no one is watching, doing the work no one will ever clap for. That is leadership. That is power. And yes, that is worthy of honor. I scanned the cadets in front of me. Bright, fierce, young. But today I don't need an apology, I said. Still, I didn't look toward Darren. I need young women, especially those who feel invisible, to hear me clearly. Your worth does not begin when someone else recognizes it. Your strength is not measured in applause. It is measured in presence, in consistency, in truth. I closed my notes, let the silence settle, then offered one final sentence. You don't need to be seen to be significant, and I stepped back. There was no roar of applause, no thunder, Just something better. A long, rising swell of hands slowly coming together. Not a performance, but a reckoning, a recognition. The kind of applause you don't chase because it means more when it finds you. I glanced toward the back. Darren was standing still, both hands clasped in front of him, head slightly bowed. For the first time since he was a boy, I saw him not as my son. Defensive, reactive, too busy building his world to notice mine, but as a man who had finally stopped talking long enough to listen. He didn't wave, didn't mouth words. He just lowered his gaze and nodded. A quiet, heavy nod. One that didn't erase the past, but finally honored it. And in that moment, I knew. He saw me. Not as the mother who packed his lunches or folded his shirts, but as the woman who once carried lives in silence and stood tall through it all. The steps echoed a little louder in the aftermath of ceremony, not because the halls were empty, but because something had shifted in me. I had just walked off that stage where my silence was no longer mistaken for absence. The cadets had listened, truly listened, not with awe, but with that kind of quiet hunger that comes from realizing you've been taught a half-truth your whole life. And now I just wanted air. I pushed open the side door of the auditorium and let the warm evening settle around my shoulders. The breeze carried hints of cut grass and faint jet fuel from the nearby training airfield. Familiar, comforting even. That's when I saw him. Darren. He was standing under a low maple tree by the stone memorial wall where the names of fallen officers were etched in granite. Hands in pockets, not moving, not fidgeting, just still. He hadn't approached me after the speech, hadn't lingered near the front rows like a proud son might. He stayed in the shadows. Now I understood why. I walked toward him without saying a word. Each step felt deliberate, not heavy but measured. He looked up when he heard me. His eyes weren't red, but they weren't dry either. His face had softened in a way I hadn't seen since he was maybe 16, that brief sliver of time before ambition had hardened into defensiveness. I didn't know, he said. 4 words this time. A little more than before, but not much. I looked at him, my son, and for a moment I could see both the boy I'd rocked to sleep and the man who had once dismissed me on stage with a laugh. Both existed at once now, and both I realized were capable of change. You didn't ask, I said gently. Not an accusation, just truth. He looked down at his feet. I think I didn't want to know. I nodded, because knowing would have meant rethinking what you built on top of it. He didn't answer right away. Then he whispered, I feel like I erased you. That landed between us like a pebble dropped into still water. I allowed it, I said. I made it easy for you not to see me. I thought that was part of being a mother. Stepping aside. But it wasn't fair, he murmured. No, I agreed, but it was real. He was quiet for a long time. Then I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. He finally looked at me. Do you forgive me? I didn't rush. Forgiveness isn't a performance. It's not something you hand over in a tidy line. I don't need to forgive you, I said softly. Because I never hated you. I just waited for you to see me. That took him by surprise. He blinked fast, like he didn't know where to put those words. I see you now, he said, voice tight. I didn't smile. Not yet. I know. I could tell that was enough for him. Not perfect, but enough. He took a deep breath and stepped back. I'll see you again soon, he said. I nodded, and with that he walked off. Not hurried, not ashamed, just a little more aware than before. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of a class of cadets. A seminar titled Crisis Command and Quiet Leadership. 12 students. Diverse, sharp, brimming with the kind of restlessness only young minds can hold. They didn't fidget. They didn't check their phones. They were used to discipline, yes, but they were also drawn to something they couldn't quite name. They had read about me, of course, watched the clips, seen the articles, but now they wanted the version behind the titles. I brought no slides, no podium, just a simple folder and a framed photo that sat beside me on the table. In the photo, I was 24, dressed in my service uniform, exhausted, holding a newborn Darren in my arms. The date was handwritten on the back in blue ink, June 3, 1990. That day, I had reported for duty just 48 hours after giving birth. No one forced me. I had volunteered for the rotation. I wasn't trying to be noble. I just believed that serving and mothering weren't mutually exclusive. The cadets leaned forward as I spoke. I told them about silence, not as submission but as strategy, about the missions that never made the news, about how leadership is often defined by what you don't say, and how you carry the weight that no one else can see. Sometimes I said leadership means being underestimated until the moment it matters most. They nodded. Some scribbled. One even recorded with permission. Near the end of class, a young woman raised her hand. Her name tag read, Cadet Shapiro. She was small, but her voice was firm. "Ma'am," she asked, "did you ever feel invisible?" The room quieted. Even the air paused. I looked at the photo, then back at her. "I didn't need to be seen," I said, pausing. "I just needed not to be forgotten." The words hung there. No flourish, no dramatic tone, just the truth. And it landed hard. When the seminar ended, they stood and saluted. Not all at once, not perfectly, but it meant more because it wasn't rehearsed. One by one they left, and I remained for a moment longer. I packed my notes, slipped the photo back into its case, and walked toward the exit. The hallway was bright with late afternoon light, that golden time where shadows are long but soft. As I stepped through the door, a gentle breeze met me. No cameras, no crowd, just light. It touched my shoulders, not with grandiosity, but with precision. Not dramatic, just right, exactly where it needed to be. If you've ever felt like your story was being written without you, if you've ever been the quiet presence behind someone else's spotlight, then maybe like me, being unseen doesn't mean being unworthy. Have you ever stayed silent to protect others only to be forgotten in the process? What would you say now if you finally had the room to speak? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and I know I'm not the only one who needs to hear your voice. If this story touched something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss the next story of strength, sacrifice, and quiet redemption. You are not alone, and your story matters.